Thanks for tuning in to this special summer broadcast of Moments That Matter. We're picking up where we left off last episode with part 3 of our discussion with the authors of How Shall We Then Care?
So in speaking about empathy, that segues nicely to Danielle's chapter, which is chapter 5 in the book, Empathy as Christian Calling. So we've talked a lot about empathy. Let's talk about maybe a different aspect, or a unique aspect for your chapter. You came up with this acronym, ACTS, ACTS, and that is a lot of kind of where you land with the chapter. And so can you kind of lead us through the acronym, what it means and how it relates to empathy?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think when I was doing research into empathy, I came at it, when I'm reading as two parts. I'm reading as a researcher, but I'm also reading as a teacher. And I'm wanting to know, how am I going to take this back to the classroom? How does this apply? And so when you get into empathy research, a lot of it is theory. And it's really good to have theory. But a lot of teachers want to know, what does this mean? How am I going to apply this? And so I started to ask that question to myself, like, how do I apply empathy? How would you actually get empathy and say to a teacher, get more empathy into the classroom? If you wanted to incorporate it into more, for teachers to say, I wanted to be more empathetic. I wanted to make that more of a goal as a teacher, that, in my interactions with others, with my students. And so I thought that's something as a personal goal I wanted to do. And so I came up with the acronym of ACTS, which stands for actively listen, communicate back, think with empathy, and then speak a response. And it's all based on empathy literature that I've kind of found. And in the chapter, I kind of talk about how I came up with that and where in the literature I came up with, and I talk about how to incorporate that. But just the goal really is that what I'm hoping people would do is that in moments when we're interacting with others, that we can slow ourselves down and really just kind of remind ourselves that acronym. And I even do this with myself, is that when I am in interaction with other, I would remind myself just to say to my ACTS and remind myself, okay, am I actively listening to this person? Because it's so easy to, in conversation, to be thinking about, what am I going to say? Or what do I need to be doing? Or what's my grocery list? Or what other things I've got going on, right? Because we have so many things, especially as a teacher in the classroom. There's what's going on over there? And I got to get the kids here. And what am I going to be teaching? And I can have students who are trying to share their heart with me. And so if I have a student who's trying to share a need with me, and I'm needing to show them care, am I actively listening to their concern, to their need, right? And so, that was the first thing I thought about. I need to actively listen. And then the second one is that communicate back. I realized that a lot of times there can be that miscommunication of what I think a student may need, and what they feel like they need. And I was thinking kind of in Sean's research, when we talk about that response, when somebody feels like their need has been met and that care has been met or not, and kind of that making that whole. I always think of care almost in a way like a circle. Like I put the care out and the care is met, and then the circle is formed. And so I want to make sure that I'm creating that circle. But I want to make sure that I know what care to put out. So I communicate back that I understand what they're saying their need is or their issue is. And then the third part is that think with empathy. And so thinking with empathy, I talk about in the chapter what that means, engaging in that cognitive process of empathy. And so that comes into that empathy literature. And then there's some really good information in empathy literature that talks about actually then speaker response. You have to do something. You can't just be like, okay, I feel for you. You actually have to do something for your people. And that's where then we close the gap, we finish the care, and in that doing something, that speaking response, then we would be checking with our student or the individual to make sure that they have felt like the care has been met. We've closed this loop, and we can then move on and stuff. So in my chapter, it's a lot about talking about ACTS, and then I also use to talk about how I use it in the K through 12 world. I've also worked in the higher ed world. So I talk about my experiences using it with all different groups of students. I feel like it's not just a small child thing. I use it with adults. When I'm, at church, when I'm in the grocery store and I'm interacting with people, it's not a student to teacher relationship. This is a people interaction. This is something that we can do just to show care with others. So I really felt like it was a way for us to for at least me to be able to slow myself down and be able to think about, am I really showing empathy in a way that helps people then get into showing that care?
That's great, Daniel. Thank you. The next two chapters in the book, I don't know what's going on, have to do with ethic of care and inclusive education, and unfortunately neither of those authors are with us, David Anderson and Alicia Watkin. So we're going to go on to the next chapter, which is chapter 8, Dispositions, Real-Time Active Practice, by Michelle Hughes. So again, I found this personally important because Christian ethic of care for us at our university at Southern Wesleyan is our dispositions for the School of Education. So pretty much that's where all of this has come from as far as I'm concerned. So in your chapter, Michelle, you emphasize the necessity and significance of cultivating dispositions and heart skills in teacher preparation. And you suggest that teachers consider how to, quote, demonstrate care and love for students and colleagues in deeper ways. Do you feel that there is an added urgency to foster dispositions in new and veteran teachers during the current pandemic that we're experiencing with the pivot to remote learning, as well as during our country's changing landscape with Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, definitely. Have been feeling that urgency and have had moments where, as I mentioned earlier, I'm wrestling with the how-to or what's next. Thankfully it's summer, so there's a bit of time to step back from some of the task-oriented pieces of my teaching and work so that I can reflect on what has occurred. And as I mentioned, I want to shift from surviving COVID into thriving into this uncertainty of what's next. And I think that's also been highlighted because of the Black Lives Matter movement as well. My work in dispositions in this particular chapter is a follow-up study, longitudinal to my dissertation. And the highlights of the chapter itself are that, and the conclusions are that we as teachers, we need opportunities to practice dispositions and build our self-awareness. and we need a toolbox. We need to be sharing and talking about the ways we model and demonstrate dispositions such as empathy and humility and compassion. And we really need, I think the bottom line, which is one of the big things I've been thinking about, is the time and the space. And we may be getting there with all that's happening in our country. I mean, I think the urgency has arrived, and I'm hoping once our school districts make their decisions for fall and plan A, B, and C, that then maybe some of the professional development will highlight dispositions, will highlight opportunities, for experience, as you were talking about with the game. We need to practice active listening together. And yes, it's about teacher to student, but I also think we really need to think about colleague to colleague. I mean, I think we have to provide those opportunities. I think about this in so many ways, and wanting the disposition of curiosity has come to the surface for me. In our program, we have 4 dispositions that we highlight: lifelong learner or curiosity, reflective reflective practitioner, being compassionate, and then also being grateful, or having a servant's heart for gratitude. And I've been thinking a lot about curiosity and how that can play into understanding our students and our colleagues' stories. And that I need to lean in, I need to ask questions, I need to find out about my colleagues and my students' stories, and be ready to listen and figure out how to provide those opportunities in my own classroom. Even asking my student teachers when we come back in the fall, let's talk about summer. Let's talk about what you reflected on. What have you learned? Have you unlearned anything? The tangibles, I need the tangibles to go along with the intangibles. So those are some of the things I've been wrestling with. I'll also mention what I noticed during the COVID period this spring, as I was observing student teachers, is one of the beautiful things that came across on Zoom. All my student teachers became more patient.
Mm-hmm.
All my student teachers became more compassionate, more wait time, more empathy in the voice. I mean, it was like one day I was, observing and taking my notes, and I had this, oh my gosh, the patience. They all deserve a trip to Hawaii to be with Danielle. A different level that I hope will translate into the face-to-face interactions that we hope to get back to someday. But those are some beautiful gifts related to dispositions that I've seen. And again, I'm personally just wrestling with how to and what's next. But again, I hope we can create space and opportunity for conversation and for leaning in and for listening, so that we can all get better and do better at care.
And just a follow-up question, talking about coming back in the fall, what do you think that principals and school leaders can do to intentionally foster dispositional awareness and dispositional development in their teachers?
Yeah, again, I think they've got to be intentional. And I think a lot of the focus on social emotional learning is wonderful. And anytime we engage in those conversations, I think we are able to reflect and put ourselves in another's shoes. But we need to, I would suggest reading books together and talking about books and talking, on all of these different areas of care, understanding the other. So many books by Black authors are being highlighted these days, children's books. And I just think we need opportunities. We need an opportunity to sit down and write for a few minutes. What did you learn this summer? Before we start talking about it, let's write about it. Let's reflect. then let's do some pair share together as colleagues. We do a lot of reflection on our own. It's a habit. It's ingrained in us as teachers, but we just don't create the space. So I think the first and foremost is creating the space, like we do to analyze data and test scores. Let's create some space in our professional development with each other. And sadly, one of the things I found from my participants in my follow-up study in Chapter 8 is that teachers move from a pre-service program into their teaching job, and there's no one directing their dispositional development or their self-awareness except for themselves. Except for, they're doing it themselves, obviously, and that's great. But we may have to do it one-on-one or with our lunch groups. We should be intentional. And again, my hope and prayer is that our school leaders will be intentional and will give people the space rather than a program and a curriculum and a test score. Those things are important too, but I think we need that heart piece needs to be developed in all of us.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
The next chapter in the book is Stephanie Talley's chapter on self and soul care. And I would just note for everybody that the byline for the book is A Christian Educator's Guide to Caring for Self, Learners, Colleagues, and Community. And that order is intentional. We do not want to forget self-care, and as Stephanie terms it, soul care. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of those things, Stephanie?
So this emerged as part of my dissertation research as well. I also used prompted theory, so you're kind of uncovering as you go. And it was an offhanded comment my participant made one day after the recorder was off. She just made a comment that it was interesting that as she had moved through our faith-based program, that she had had a lot of instruction about how her faith should inform her practices, like the issues of social justice and how you treat children and classroom management and things like that. But we had been talking about how important her small group was in her faith community to her first year of teaching. And she said, that's interesting. Y'all never talked to us anything about our faith sustaining our teaching. And I just kind of sat there when she left, like, oh my goodness, we missed the boat. We talked about faith just to inform her practices, which is really important. Mm-hmm. We didn't talk to her any about how faith sustains our practices. And then when I combine that with the fact that I work largely with females at the elementary level who come into teaching and have this idea that teaching and mothering are these self-sacrificing, give everything over, I take care of everyone else first. It's just a really dangerous narrative. And then I started to read the work of Nell Noddings, and I started to read Parker Palmer. So I think it's really important. One of the things that I often tell my students is I have to believe, and Sean alluded to this, I have to believe everyone into teaching because they cared. I don't believe that anyone walked across the stage and got their diploma and their teaching and said, I can't wait to go to schools and be mean to children and their families and my coworkers. This is going to be awesome. But something happened along the way, and the more I watch and the more I observe and the more I listen and the more I dig into the stories, for me, what I saw was with myself, with my participant, with everything happening, part of the condition of their soul. Because as Parker Palmer says, we project the condition of our soul onto our students. And so if you don't pay attention to that and guard that and actively care for that, you can find yourself on a very dangerous path in teaching. So the question I try to raise with teachers or with pre-service teachers or with my faculty is, what are you doing to guard the condition of your soul, and how is that related to self-care? And not self-care, there is a piece of self-care that is maybe going to get a manicure or a pedicure. I'm all for that, but I'm talking about a little deeper issue. I'm talking about soul care. I'm talking about Sabbath and rest. I'm talking about biblical principles of rejuvenation and where does your soul get rest? Where does it find what it needs to do this really difficult job we do going into schools. So it was just a conversation that I noticed in my work was not happening. And then I found you guys, and I found other people's work, and I found, and so I was just thinking about how do we not only talk to them about how faith informs practice, but how do we talk to them about how faith sustains practice? And relied a lot on Kathy Freitag's work in that area. So.
Yeah, in my ethics class, I read to them the poem, The Angel in the House. And because Virginia Woolf has a lot to say about that poem. And I say, do you know in your life an angel in the house? Do you know, was it the grandmother? Was it the mother? Was it, whoever who is just like, no, you go first. And if there's, like when you're eating at the table, and if anything's left, then I'll have it, or something like this. And that this is like ingrained in us, that this is virtuous, and has been for hundreds of years. And then we say to them, at least in our School of Ed, we say to them that, before you can really talk about, care for your students, your colleagues, the community, you really have to talk about care for yourself.
Right.
And it's just kind of, we get them in their third semester as undergrads. And if we discount the student teaching semester, we have 5 semesters that we have to beat it out of them,
Right.
that this is selfish. And I really need to just think about everybody else and, and that sort of thing. And then by the end, they are pretty convinced by the end of it, especially by the end of student teaching. They're convinced of it.
It's a powerful narrative in our culture. I just had a graduate class unpack perceptions of teachers in popular media. And when you have, I love freedom writers, but when you have someone who sacrificed a marriage, or someone who the ideal is Miss Honey adopts Matilda, or you have these narratives in popular culture where to be a successful teacher and to be the one that's on the movie screen that's held up, you sacrifice everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it does take a lot to get that narrative out and to help them see that that's not the way of our faith either. That's not the biblical example we have. That's not how you look at Christ doing ministry. So
I personally was very grateful for your chapter,
Thank you.
that it's included in the book. And I just want to mention there is one more chapter in the book, and it is caring for new teachers once they leave campus, which is also has been alluded to as something also very important. And that chapter is by Elaine Tinholt. And that is the book. So I was wondering if anyone would like to offer any either summary comments or just kind of general observations, or maybe my co-host who's been sitting here patiently the entire time caring for you all, maybe he has something to say as well. So I'll just throw it open.
Let me just say this. I have not met any one of you or seen your faces before today, but knowing Paul and his comments and words regarding the collaborative effort that you all have taken part in, I feel like I know you. And I just, in hearing what you say, I really know your heart. And it's such an honor just to hear what you're doing and to recognize the impact that you're having, truly an eternal impact. And I feel like you're just absolutely kindred spirits. And I just so honor that. And thank you for the work that you're doing. And everything you've said is so key. I've known Paul for 4 years. I work here in our Center for Teaching Excellence, mostly with faith integration. And so this stuff is just so exciting to see how faith becomes active and transfers to our instructors who are touching and ministering to people that the traditional ministries of church and things like that might not reach in any way. And I think this is such an important work. And so it's just an honor to meet all of you and to see your faces and to dream that I was in Hawaii right now and all those kind of great things. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
All right. Well, I just want to say that you all are amazing people, and I've known that for years, but you continue to be amazing. And yes, I am very much looking forward to that writers conference in Hawaii. Yeah, we are gonna work that out. So, well, thank you again, and thank you to our listeners for your kind indulgence as we kind of walk through the book, and we hope that you'll get that book, which is again, How Shall We Then Care? A Christian Educator's Guide to Caring for Self, Learners, Colleagues, and Community. And well, till next time, thanks.